My father called me into his office on a Thursday morning and closed the door behind me, and I knew from the way he closed it that whatever was about to happen had been prepared in advance. He sat behind his desk. He did not ask me to sit down. He placed a folder on the desk between us and opened it and turned it to face me and said he needed me to explain what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a transaction record. 3 separate withdrawals from the company's operating account over a period of 11 weeks, totaling $46,000. Each transfer had been routed through a secondary account that existed in the company's system under my login credentials. Each transfer had been authorized with my digital signature. I had never seen those transactions before in my life. My father's name is Gerald. He built his company over 30 years, a mid-sized logistics operation that handled regional freight and warehousing contracts. He was methodical and fair and had the particular quality of people who build things from nothing, a deep suspicion of waste and a clear memory for numbers. He had brought me into the business 4 years earlier when I finished my accounting degree. He had trusted me with the financial operations because he said I had his head for figures and his mother's attention to detail. He was looking at me from across that desk the way you look at something you thought you knew and are reconsidering. I told him I had not made those transactions. I told him I had never seen those transfer records. I told him the secondary account routed through my credentials was not an account I had created or authorized. He said my name. Just once. The way you say someone's name when you want them to understand that you are being serious. He said the IT audit trail showed my credentials on every access point. He said the secondary account had been created on a Tuesday evening when I had stayed late in the office alone. He said the transfers had happened on 3 separate occasions when I was the last person to leave. I asked who had run the audit. He said the company's external accountant had flagged the discrepancy during a routine quarterly review and brought it to him directly. I asked who else had access to my login credentials. He did not answer that question immediately. The door opened before he could. My brother's name is Marcus. He is 4 years older than me and had been at the company for 7 years by then, running the operations side while I handled finance. He came in with the expression of someone who had been waiting outside for a cue. He sat in the chair my father had not offered me and looked at the folder on the desk and shook his head slowly with the careful sorrow of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. He said he had hoped it wasn't true. He said he had noticed some irregularities a few weeks earlier and had brought them to the external accountant himself because he hadn't wanted to believe what he was seeing. He said coming to Dad had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He said all of this without looking at me directly, which I noted. I told my father Marcus had access to my credentials. I told him I had shared my login password with Marcus 8 months earlier during a period when I had been traveling for a contract review and he had needed to access a specific financial record on my behalf. I told him this had been a mistake in protocol that I took responsibility for, but that it meant my credentials alone were not definitive evidence. Marcus said he had never used my login. He said it calmly. The way you say something you have decided to say regardless of what the other person says in response. My father looked between us. The thing I saw on his face during that look was something I had never seen there before, not directed at me. He was doing the calculation of 2 conflicting accounts and arriving somewhere that was not certainty either way, but the uncertainty itself was the damage. 3 years of managing his finances carefully and precisely, and the uncertainty could still land. He said he needed time to review everything properly before making any decisions. He said he was going to bring in an independent forensic accountant. He said until that process was complete, he was asking me to step back from my financial responsibilities. He said he was sorry to have to do it. I told him I understood. I told him the independent review would show what I was telling him was true. I kept my voice level because there was nothing to gain from anything else, and because I was not yet fully processing what was happening. The particular numbness that descends when something is happening too quickly for emotion to keep pace with it. I walked out of that office, past Marcus, who was still in his chair. He looked at me as I passed. For just a moment, there was nothing in his expression that resembled the sorrow he had performed for our father. What was there instead was something I had seen occasionally over the years and had never been able to name correctly. I could name it now. Relief. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time. I thought about the folder, the transaction records, the digital trail pointing cleanly at me, the secondary account created on the evening I had stayed late alone. I thought about the 8 months since I had given Marcus my password, the specific request he had made and why, the fact that I had given it without changing it afterward because I had trusted him. He was my brother. I had trusted him because he was my brother. I went inside and called my friend Simone and told her what had happened and listened to the silence on her end that meant she was absorbing something she needed time to fully take in. Then, I told her I was going to need a lawyer. The forensic accountant my father hired was a precise woman named Dr. Alicia Forday, who had spent 20 years examining financial records in disputed situations and had the particular quality of someone completely uninterested in the human drama surrounding her work. She spent 6 weeks examining the company's systems. She reviewed every transaction, every access log, every timestamp, every IP address associated with account activity. She interviewed everyone who had system access. She requested documentation going back 18 months. Her report was thorough and her conclusions were carefully qualified in the language of forensic accounting. She said the evidence was consistent with credential misuse rather than direct account access. She said the IP address logs for 2 of the 3 transfer events showed access from a location inconsistent with my known work patterns. She said the secondary account had been set up with technical knowledge of the company's banking system that was more consistent with operational experience than financial experience. She said, in the language of careful professional qualification, that the evidence did not support a definitive conclusion against me. What she could not say definitively was that it pointed at Marcus. He had covered that ground carefully. The IP logs were routed. The operational knowledge was circumstantial. He had prepared whatever he had prepared with enough competence that the forensic review produced doubt without resolution. My father believed the qualified conclusions. He called me and said the review had not established what he had initially feared, and he was sorry for the disruption to my role. He said I was welcome to return to my position. I told him I needed time to think about it. He sounded surprised. I think he had expected gratitude and immediate return. I think the idea that I might need time to consider returning after being asked to step back on evidence that had not held up had not fully occurred to him. I took 3 weeks to give him an answer. During those 3 weeks, I did several things. I met with a lawyer named Daisy who specialized in employment and fraud matters and who spent 2 sessions helping me understand what had happened and what it meant legally and professionally. She said, Dr. Forday's report was useful but not conclusive, and that without a clear identification of the actual source, I was in a position of being unproven innocent rather than proven innocent. She said those were different positions professionally, even when they felt like they should be the same. I called every professional contact I had developed in 4 years of doing my job well and told them the short version of what had happened. I did this before the version filtered through professional networks on its own, which it would. I wanted the people who mattered to hear it from me first in my own words. Most of them responded with more warmth than I expected. 2 of them offered to provide references immediately and without being asked. One of them mentioned that Marcus had a particular professional reputation in the logistics sector that was worth noting. She did not elaborate. I filed the observation. I spoke with my mother, whose name is Harriet, and who had known for 30 years how to navigate the relationship between my father's authority and her own clear reading of the people around her. She called me on the 2nd week of the 3 weeks. She said she had questions about what had happened that my father's summary had not answered. She listened to my account for a long time. She said she knew what she thought, but that saying it out loud in the house she shared with my father was complicated by the thing it would set in motion. I told her I understood. She said she was sorry for that complication. I told her the complication belonged to Marcus, not to her. At the end of the 3 weeks, I called my father and told him I was not coming back. I told him the reason was not anger at him or at the process. I told him the reason was that I was not able to work in an environment where the question of what had happened had been answered with qualified doubt rather than full clarity, and where the person I believed was responsible was still running operations 3 floors below the financial office. He was quiet for a long time. He asked if I was certain about what I believed. I told him I was certain. I told him what I knew about the password and the timing and the specific things that Dr. Ford's report had qualified carefully without naming. I laid it out the way I would lay out a financial discrepancy in a client report. Clear and sourced and without editorial. He said he would look into it. I told him I hoped he would. Then I resigned formally in writing through 8 days and began building a professional life that did not depend on my father's company or my brother's continued goodwill. Marcus called me once during that period. The call lasted 4 minutes. He said he was sorry about how everything had unfolded. He said these things were complicated and he hoped we could keep the family together through it. He said he hoped I knew he had never wanted any of this. I told him I knew exactly what he had wanted. He was quiet. I ended the call. Simone came over that evening and we sat on my apartment floor and ate takeout, and she did not try to reframe anything or locate silver linings. She just stayed in the accurate weight of the situation with me, which was what I needed. She said she believed me. I thanked her. She said there was nothing to thank her for. I had lost my job. I had lost easy access to my family. I had a professional record that contained qualified doubt where it should have contained nothing. What I still had was what I actually knew and the clarity of knowing it. That would have to be enough to build from. The first position I took after leaving my father's company was at a regional accounting firm called Pemberton Associates that handled mid-market clients across manufacturing and freight. I had found it through one of the contacts I had called during the 3 weeks. A colleague named Warren, who had worked alongside me on 2 contract reviews over the years and had received my account of what happened and responded by forwarding my name to the managing partner at Pemberton the following day. The managing partner's name was Claudette. She interviewed me herself and asked direct questions about the situation at my father's company without softening them. I answered every question directly and completely. I did not manage the account or soften the edges. I gave her the full version, including what I believed Marcus had done and what Dr. Ford's report had and had not established, and what my resignation had meant. She listened and then said she had spent 23 years in financial practice and had a reliable instinct for the difference between someone who had done something and someone who had been near something that was done. She said her instinct in my case was clear. She offered me a position as senior associate. I accepted and started the following Monday. I was 31 years old, starting again from a position I should have been past. The adjustment required a particular kind of discipline. Not the discipline of working hard, which I had always done. The discipline of not letting what had happened become the filter through which I viewed everything that came after. Some days that was easier than others. On the harder days, I came in earlier and stayed later, and put the additional hours into work that was clean and documented, and mine in a way that could not be rerouted. Claudette managed the way Dominic, in a story I had heard from a colleague once, had managed. Expectations were stated. Contributions were acknowledged specifically. When I did something well, she said so in the concrete terms of what it had produced rather than the vague language of general praise. I built a record at Pemberton that was unqualified in every direction. My relationship with my father during those years was steady and careful. We spoke regularly. He had taken my account of Marcus seriously enough to initiate his own review of the company's operations, which had produced findings that were uncomfortable but not conclusive in the direction of the specific transactions Dr. Ford had examined. Marcus was good at the architecture of covering things. He had had 7 years to learn the company's systems and had used that knowledge in both directions. My father did not say directly that he believed me. He said he was looking carefully at some things. He said he appreciated my patience with the process. He said the company had made changes to its credential protocols and access management. I told him I was glad. My mother called me on the first Sunday of every month. She was warmer and more direct in those calls than she was able to be in the house she shared with my father. where the situation had the particular weight of a thing that could not be fully named, because naming it fully would require a confrontation that would cost more than the people in that house had decided to spend. She asked about my work, and I told her. She asked about Simone and my life outside work. She said she missed me in the honest way of someone who had not seen enough of me and knew why and could not change it yet. I told her yet was a word worth holding on to. She said she was trying. Marcus and I did not speak during those years except at family occasions where not speaking would have been more conspicuous than speaking. Christmas dinners. A cousin's wedding. My father's 65th birthday, which was a party my mother had organized at a restaurant and which required me to sit at the same table as Marcus for 3 hours. He was the same at those occasions as he had always been, socially fluent, present in the right ways, the quality of performance I had grown up beside and had sometimes mistaken for character. I watched him at my father's birthday dinner. He gave a toast that was generous and specific and made my father laugh. He moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms, with an ease that came from understanding how to read what people wanted from him and providing it. I thought about the folder on my father's desk, the transaction records, the relief in his eyes as I walked past him. I thought about what Adies had said about being unproven innocent versus proven innocent and how those were different positions professionally. I was building the proven version, one documented, attributed specific piece of work at a time. Marcus was still running operations at my father's company. He had been there 11 years by then. He had been given additional responsibilities when I left. He had consolidated his position in the company in the particular way that people consolidate positions when the person who might have questioned them is no longer in the building. I was not watching him. I did not spend my energy watching him because energy spent watching him was energy not spent building my own record. But Simone mentioned something at dinner one evening that she had heard through a professional acquaintance who worked in the same freight sector. She mentioned it carefully, the way she delivered information she thought I needed without being certain I wanted it. She said she had heard Marcus's name in a context that was not favorable. She said the context was financial. I told her to tell me what she had heard. What Simone had heard came from a woman named Preeti who worked in compliance at a freight brokerage that had done business with my father's company for several years. Preeti and Simone knew each other through a professional network. Preeti had mentioned, in the context of a broader conversation about industry practices, that a logistics company she dealt with had recently had a vendor relationship terminated under circumstances that raised questions. She had named the company. She had named my father's company. Simone told me this, and I sat with it for a day before I did anything. I did not want to move too quickly on secondhand information passed through 2 degrees of professional acquaintance. I had spent 3 years building something careful and clean, and I was not going to compromise it by acting on something that might resolve into nothing. I called Adies instead. Daisy had remained my lawyer in an ongoing advisory capacity since my resignation. She was pragmatic and thorough and had been watching the situation at my father's company with the detached professional interest of someone who had seen similar patterns before and understood that they tended to develop in consistent directions. She had something to tell me before I finished explaining why I was calling. She said she had been contacted 3 weeks earlier by an investigator named Raymond who worked for an insurance company that held a policy on my father's company's cargo operations. Raymond had been conducting a routine investigation into a claims pattern that had developed over 18 months. Several cargo loss claims had been filed, paid, and subsequently flagged by an internal review algorithm as statistically inconsistent with the company's historical claims rate. The investigation had identified a pattern of losses that occurred under specific operational conditions. The conditions correlated with a subset of routes managed under a particular operational system. The operational system was Marcus's. Adies had not contacted me earlier because the investigation was ongoing and she had not wanted to introduce noise into a process that needed to develop without interference. She said Raymond had asked her, as part of his background interviews, about the financial situation that had led to my departure from the company 4 years earlier. She said she had provided him with a full account. She said Raymond wanted to speak with me. I met Raymond at a Daisy's office the following week. He was methodical and unassuming and asked questions the way accountants ask questions, in a sequence that built toward a shape rather than reaching for a conclusion in advance. He had reviewed Dr. Forde's original report. He had the financial records that Ada's had retained from my time at the company. He had his own 18 months of cargo claims documentation. He asked me about Marcus's operational access, about the overlap between operations and finance in the company's system, about the specific technical knowledge required to route transactions through a secondary credential, about the period when I had given Marcus my password. He asked me what I thought Marcus had been building at the company over the time I had worked there. I told him I thought Marcus had been building a position. That is 7 years before my arrival, and the 4 years since my departure had been used to make himself the central load-bearing element of the company's operations in ways that made him difficult to remove and easy to protect. I told him the $46,000 in the transaction records had never been about the money specifically. The amount was not large enough to explain the risk unless the risk was actually the point. Unless what the transactions were designed to produce was not capital but my exit. Raymond wrote something in his notebook. He asked why my exit would have been worth that risk. I told him I was the only person in the building with the financial training and the day-to-day access to eventually see what Marcus was doing with the cargo operations. I told him I had been there 4 years and was still learning the business. Given another 2 or 3 years, I would have seen it. Raymond nodded slowly. He said that was consistent with what the claims pattern suggested about timing. The investigation took 7 months from the point of my meeting with Raymond to the point at which it produced formal findings. During those months, I continued at Pemberton and told no one except Simone what was developing. Claudette noticed I was carrying something I was not sharing and asked if everything was all right. I told her a family situation was working itself toward a resolution, and she nodded and asked no further questions. My father called me 3 months into those 7 months. He said the insurance company had been in contact about a claims review and had requested access to operational records. He said Marcus had told him it was routine. He said something in the way Marcus had said it was routine had stayed with him. He asked me what I knew. I told him I was aware of the investigation. I told him I had spoken with the investigator. I told him I had done so because I had been asked to and because I had told the truth about everything I knew, the same way I had told the truth about everything I knew 4 years ago in his office. He was quiet for a long time. He said he had been thinking about Dr. Forde's report, about the qualifications in it. He said he had read it again recently, and the qualifications had a different weight on a second reading 4 years later with additional context around them. I did not say I had told him so. There was nothing to gain from it, and it was not the kind of thing I wanted to be the person who said. I told him the investigation would reach its own conclusions and that he should make sure he had good legal advice around him when it did. He said he had already retained someone. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long. I told him what mattered was the direction he was moving in now. I meant it. The insurance company's investigation concluded in a report that Raymond described to me in a call as comprehensive and unambiguous in its findings. Marcus had been running a systematic cargo diversion operation for 6 years. The operation involved routing legitimate freight consignments through a secondary logistics chain that he controlled through a network of shell vendors he had established over time. The diverted cargo was sold. Insurance claims were filed for the losses. The proceeds from the diversion and the insurance payments went into accounts structured to make tracing difficult. The $46,000 from the transactions that had been attributed to me was not a coincidence in its timing. Raymond confirmed what I had told him about the logic of it. Marcus's operation had been developing when I arrived at the company. My presence in the financial operations had represented a genuine risk to him. The framing had been designed and executed with the specific goal of removing that risk. The forensic accountant who worked the insurance investigation found the secondary accounts, found the vendor shells, found the transaction chains Marcus had routed and rerouted and covered with the operational knowledge of someone who had built the architecture himself and understood every load-bearing point. He had been less careful about the cargo side than the financial side. Because the cargo side was operationally his, and he believed his authority over it was complete enough that nobody would look at the right level of detail. Raymond told me the total across 6 years was just under $2 million. The insurance company filed a civil complaint. Law enforcement opened a parallel criminal investigation. My father retained a legal team that spent 2 weeks reviewing everything the insurance investigation had produced and concluded that the findings were credible and thorough and that the company's only productive path forward was full cooperation. Marcus was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I found out from my mother, who called me as soon as she heard. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been holding a weight for years and had just been told to set it down. She said his name and then could not immediately say anything else. I told her I was sorry. I meant it in the way you can mean something and have it contain things that seem contradictory. Sorry for what the arrest meant for her. Sorry for what the truth cost the family in its full emergence. Not sorry that it had emerged. My father called that evening. The call lasted 40 minutes and covered more ground than any conversation we had managed in the 4 years since I resigned. He said the legal team had reviewed Dr. Forty's original report in the context of the insurance investigation findings, and the conclusion was clear. He said he had known on some level for longer than he had admitted to himself. He said the thing that had stopped him from pushing harder earlier was the same thing that had allowed Marcus to operate as long as he had. The particular difficulty of applying rigorous scrutiny to a person you love in a direction you do not want the scrutiny to go. He said he had failed to protect me from his own limitations. He told me directly that he believed what I had told him 4 years ago in his office and had not fully allowed himself to believe at the time. He said the word sorry, and he said it with the specific weight of someone who understood the word was not large enough for what it was being asked to carry, but was offering it anyway. I told him I heard him. I told him we were going to have to find a way to rebuild things, and that I was willing to try if he was. He said he had never stopped wanting to try. The criminal process moved on its own timeline. Marcus entered a guilty plea 8 months after the arrest. The sentencing hearing was attended by our family, in the particular way families attend things they cannot not attend, present and fractured, and holding what they were feeling with varying degrees of success. I sat beside my mother. My father sat on her other side. None of us spoke much before it began. I did not feel what people sometimes expect you to feel at a moment like that. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. What I felt was closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a thing that has been unresolved for years, reaching its resolution and requiring you to process not just the resolution, but everything that accumulated while it was still open. Marcus looked older. That was the most specific observation I had. He looked like someone who had been carrying the weight of an architecture he had built and maintained for years, and had finally been relieved of it in the worst possible way. I thought about the relief in his eyes when I walked past him in my father's office, how it had looked then, how it looked now. The company went through a significant restructuring in the year that followed. My father brought in external operational management and retained an independent financial oversight board. He offered me a position on the oversight board in an advisory capacity. I thought about it for 2 weeks before accepting, not because I was uncertain about the answer, but because I had learned the value of decisions made at the pace that was actually honest, rather than the pace that looked decisive. I accepted with conditions. The conditions were specific and documented, and ADAs reviewed them before I submitted them. My father accepted all of them without negotiation, which told me the conversation we had on the phone after Marcus's arrest had meant what it sounded like it meant. Claudette at Pemberton was gracious when I told her I was reducing my hours to accommodate the advisory role. She said my work over 4 years had been exceptional and that the firm would accommodate what I needed. She meant it. I had built 4 years of unqualified record there, and it had produced exactly the kind of standing that accommodated real choices. Simone and I had dinner the week after the sentencing. She had been beside me through every stage of the 4 years and had never wavered in what she believed and had provided the specific kind of friendship that does not require the resolution of things to stay constant through them. I told her over dinner that I was aware of how different the 4 years would have been without her. She said she was aware of how different they would have been for her without me. We ordered dessert and talked about everything else. My mother and I spoke every Sunday now without the managed surface that had characterized the calls for 4 years. She was seeing a counselor named Bernard who was helping her process what the years of knowing and not naming had cost her. She mentioned Bernard occasionally. Not the content of the sessions, but the fact of them, which told me she was taking the work seriously. She asked me once, about 6 months after the sentencing, whether I was angry at her for not pushing harder during those years. I thought about the question honestly before answering it. I told her the honest answer was complicated. That there were moments in the 4 years when what felt like her silence had been heavy and isolating. That I had understood the position she was in, and that understanding it had not always made it easier to be in mine. That both of those things were true simultaneously and did not cancel each other out. She said she was glad I could tell her the complicated answer. I told her the complicated answer was the only one I had that was actually true. I drove home that Sunday evening through streets I had come to know over 4 years of building a life in them. The city looked ordinary in the particular way cities look when you have lived in them long enough that what they contain is yours rather than just around you. I had arrived in this version of my life with a resignation letter and a professional record containing qualified doubt and $46,000 of transactions I had not made. I had built from that. Specifically, carefully, with documentation attached to everything and my name on all of it. The doubt had been resolved eventually, not because I had forced the resolution. Because I had built such a clean and specific record over 4 years that when the investigation produced its findings, the contrast was unambiguous. The truth had its own timeline and I had not been able to accelerate it. What I had been able to do was make sure that when it arrived against a background I had prepared. The qualifications in Dr. Forde's report were gone. What remained was a full account, complete and sourced and in the public record. My name was on that account too, this time as it should have been from the beginning. I parked and went upstairs and made coffee and sat at the window and looked at the city that was mine and thought about how long it had taken to arrive somewhere that felt genuinely solid. Then I opened my laptop and started the week's work. Clean and documented and beginning.